Hello and welcome to A Sense of Centerville in Washington Township, your place for stories about ordinary and extraordinary residents and places in the Centerville and Washington Township area. I'm Susan from Centerville-Washington History, and I look forward to hearing your story. Today, my guest is Bill Gaul. Bill Gaul moved to Centerville in middle school, attending Tower Heights Middle School. He graduated from Centerville High School during a time of growth and change. Bill joined Washington Township Fire Department as a volunteer firefighter in May 1979. After 40 years of service to the department, including 12 years as chief, Bill retired in 2019. Retirement is still busy for Bill, who is on the board at Centerville-Washington History, and he also helps to care for his grandchildren. Thanks, Bill, for being here today.
Thank you, Susan.
I've been looking forward to visiting with you. You're one of the nicest people I know, and I've liked. You're also a great storyteller, so hopefully we'll have some of that.
Not too many, hopefully. Thank you for that introduction. I will say that 40 years, I didn't think much about it during the time that I was in service. In the early years, you kind of say, wow, I still have 20 years to go or 25 years to go. But as the years progress and everything moves so fast, and as I've learned, you only have one time round in life. So you learn your 20s, your 30s, your 40s, your 50s, your 60s as you're in them. But time just seems to increase. It goes so fast as you get older. At least it has for me. So as I progressed in my career, it just seemed to blink of an eye. It was here again, time to leave again. And I've been busy since I've retired. One of the reasons that I did retire, one of the most important reasons, was the grandchildren. I wanted to spend more time with my grandchildren. We have 11 grandchildren and one great-grandchild. But in the 2016, 2017, 2018 period, we lost 2 grandchildren. And one was a premature birth, almost to term, and the other was 4 months old, cardiac issues. They knew it when she was in the womb. They thought this would be a routine thing. They've dealt with it before. They just let her grow and get bigger, and then they'd operate. And it didn't work out that way. So obviously in 2018, it smacked me like a semi-truck that, what are you doing here? You spent most of your life either educating or in service. It's time maybe to back off and spend time with the kids. I love every single one of them. They all live in this area within a 20-mile radius. So any given weekend, we have 2, 3, 4, 5 at our house. And during the summer, in fact, just a week and a half ago, I was babysitting over the summer for the grandchildren. So any given week I had 7 to 5, 7 to 4. I would have 4 or 5 of the grandchildren. And they ranged in age from 12 to 7 on that side that I was keeping track of. So that long introduction, I'm sorry, but
No, and I think everyone can identify with that. Is at certain time in your life, you're like, I've got to spend time with the people that matter the most, that I want to develop the relationships with the most. And some of my favorite people have chosen to do that, to retire and spend time devoted to family pursuits, which is our most important work. So I'm so glad you started out that way, and it kind of gives an essence of who you are as a person, that you and I've met some of your grandchildren because you brought them to different things that I've seen, and they're just great kids. So why wouldn't you want to spend more time with them? And they're a treasure. I don't have grandkids myself, but
you will.
But I look forward to that.
You'll love the heck out of that.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong. I love the fire service.
Mm-hmm.
I made a lot of great acquaintances in the fire service, a lot of top-notch people, but it was time. I mean, you only get to go around once in life, as I said, and children are only 8 once and 9 once or 10. And once they get into their upper teens, as I've learned with our older grandchildren, you kind of lose them because obviously there's you and I, as we were growing up, interests change, friends change, where you need to go and want to go changes. So I do have a 22-year-old grandchild and a 21-year-old grandchild, and I've learned you better spend time with the young ones now because they're not going to be young and around forever.
Right.
Nor am I.
No. And you're not as cool to a 22-year-old as you are to an 8-year-old.
Not at all. Not at all.
For sure.
Not at all.
Yeah. Well, let's get to our questions. So we're talking about Centerville and history, but I always love talking about families, and that is what Centerville's made up of, is, families and residents. So what brought you to the Centerville and Washington Township area?
I lived in a small town outside of Boston, Massachusetts, called Marlborough, and I went to school in early years there. Life in Massachusetts is totally different than life in Ohio. I mean, when they say if you go to the deep south or to the west, it's a different culture, it's a different life. It's absolutely true. My take from what I remember from that age in Massachusetts was it was really much stricter up there. Everything seemed to be quite a bit stricter. And so I went to a school that was 5 stories tall in the 5th, 6th, 4th, 5th, 6th grade. And it was brick and mortar with windows, no elevator, 5 flights of stairs. 1968 was my last year in that school. And we had one teacher the whole period, all day, for all the subjects. We stayed in that classroom. We ate lunch in that classroom, except for maybe recess or a restroom break. You stayed in that classroom. One thing that I did enjoy was they had what you called a milk boy. Today it would be a milk person. And what it was every morning, local dairy would deliver milk cartons of white or chocolate milk to the basement where the boiler was of the building. And you could volunteer to take 10 or 15 minutes out of class sometime early in the morning to deliver these. Now, it wasn't as easy. You weren't skipping class. You weren't getting away with anything because you had metal milk crates. You had a list. And for Mrs. Jacobs' class, the kindergarten teacher, there might be 15 white milks and 2 chocolate milks. So you'd load the thing up. You'd go up the flights of stairs, sneak into the classroom, put it in the back, and then leave. And back down the stairs and the next list, whoever that was, and up and down and up and down and up and down. And that was one. And then 2, we lived a mile, right on the border of a mile away from the school. So we weren't in the bus route. So we had to walk to school every morning and walk home every night. So I became a member of the safety patrol, and we had a lot of fun doing that. So I enjoyed that also. But again, going back, the classroom was very organized, very strict, everybody knew everybody. You knew everybody's habits. You knew what they liked, what they didn't like. And then I moved to Centerville in 1969. My dad was transferred. He was an electronics engineer. Side note on that, initially we were told, being transferred to Boulder, Colorado. My parents even put a down payment on a house at the foothills of the mountains, the Rockies out in Boulder, Colorado. They showed us a picture as kids. And of course, as a 6th grader, and my 2 brothers were just 13 months each younger than I was, we're all going, yes, mountains, great, we're going to love this. Oh, my God, Colorado. Everybody talks how great it is. And on the way, we loaded up the moving van, the Allied van or whatever it was, loaded our furniture. We loaded the station wagon, and we were coming to Ohio to say, see you later to the relatives. We'll see you. We're moving to Colorado, and I think it was on the New York Turnpike. In the middle of the night, my parents told us in the car, we're not going to Colorado anymore, we're going to Ohio. And it's like, oh, man, we weren't looking forward to that. So we got to Ohio. My parents searched for a good school system. We came to Centerville. We rented a house for about 6 months, and then we moved on to, they purchased a 2-story with a basement house all the way in the south end of the county, south end of the township, down off of Social Row Road. And we now were members of the Centerville community. So in 1969, I attended Tower Heights Middle School. I was bused because we were more than a mile away.
Right.
And so it's hard to explain. It was just utter shock for me because here I come from a class of about 22 people into an open concept school with no walls. If you were studying in history or social science, you were watching the typing class and the homeroom economics class and the math classes, and everybody made noise, and there was always noise, no matter how the teachers tried to squelch it. So my 7th grade year was not, it was not a good year. It was adjusting. Or my 8th grade, 7th and 8th grade year. 9th grade, went to the high school. Totally different from the open concept because we were in classrooms again. The difference there was the high school was the MagSig building and what was called at the time the South building back behind it.
Which is now Klein.
Which is Klein now, yeah. And the football stadium was in between, and there was a road between the two. And you had classes. If you took science, it was in the South building. If you took math, it was in the MagSig building. So obviously every period you would shift, or you could possibly shift, where you walk, you get out of class, you'd hurry and walk to the next building, to your classroom, and then into that class, you'd walk back over to MagSig. You could have lunch wherever you wanted to.
It's kind of like a college campus. You'd have to walk in
way
between.
Before college for freshmen.
Yeah,
in
before
high school.
freshmen, yeah.
So that was a great time because it was different. I'd never experienced that before. Winter was a little bit tougher because whether it was ice or snow, slippery or dry, you walked wet, rain, you still had to walk back and forth. Prepare, bring an umbrella, wear your shoes, your boots, whatever the case was. My junior year, if I recall correctly, it's my sophomore, junior year, they began experimenting, the school system did, with, well, let's try, population was growing. Obviously, this graduating class was growing in size. They wanted to experiment with different start times for high school. So there was a 7 o'clock start time, you get out at 2, an 8 o'clock start time, you get out at 3, and a 9 o'clock start time, and you got out at 4. So one person could be, your friend could be in a 4th period class because they started later in the day, and you can be in your 6th period class getting ready to take your last class and go home. That only was around 1 year, as I recall.
Must have not worked out real well keeping track of people.
I'm not sure, but we didn't have to do. And then the next year, my senior year, the new high school building was built, which was the East building. So they had MagSig South, and now what is the high school today on Franklin, 500 Franklin Street, was the East building, but it was only the central unit. That's all that was there. And you could, at that time, have been bused for one class at the MagSig, over to the East, back to the South, walk to the MagSig. So there were still a lot of moving parts here until they completed the wings of the high school and everything moved over to the high school. So I took all of my classes my final year in the new building, the East building. But I had teachers that they would teach a class in MagSig, and then we'd sit in the classroom and wait for them to get over to the East. And they had about 10 minutes to move, to transport drive their car from one to the other, get in the building. And the high school doesn't sit close to the road on Franklin Street. It sits back. So you get into the building and then up to your classroom, and it's like they had no time to do
To
it,
take a breath.
comb their hair or anything.
Right.
So that was high school.
I'm glad you shared that because yeah, I mean, school systems have to build. So there is a way that they have to do that. But I feel fortunate now that the high school's all in one location and we don't have to do, I mean, still classes are taken other places, so there is busing that way. But and you mentioned the open concept, which I think is really interesting. I think when my older kids began middle school, that open concept was still there. But how distracting that was for students. I'm glad that they did some renovations to eliminate that that distraction, so making a better environment for children to learn.
Well, I'm sure they based it, and I did read somewhere that they based it on studies, and they brought a lot of teachers into it and a lot of different folks to say, rather than the classroom setting with one teacher, how about if we open this up a little bit to an open setting, more like, as you said, I think college to some degree a little bit, bigger classes, or the concept of bigger classes with everyone. And the outcome was, this could work, let's try this. And I think they did look at it every year or every other year. They finally got to the point, as you said, they decided, I'm not sure that the students are learning or they're getting as much as they would in a different type of setting. But the open concept also kind of waned and went away.
Right. Yeah, it's great for houses, open concept, but maybe not as good for schools. Yeah, so thanks for sharing that history of the schools at Centerville. And also, I remember the milk, the milk was delivered. The next question is, I wanted to talk about the places you frequented during high school. Now, some of those are probably not here, but what were the things that you did as a high schooler?
As a high schooler, we lived way south of town. Where we lived, we were in an isolated plat almost. Nut Road was where the next set of houses really were, or down Social Road. And so we were surrounded by woods and streams and open space. The polo grounds were right behind the plat that I lived in off of Nut Road. And we used to walk. We spent a lot of our time, kids in the neighborhood, playing together, whether it was exploring the woods, exploring down Social Road into Greene County, down into Warren County, up along the railroad tracks with the trestle bridge that was between Franklin Street and Nut Road. That was way back. A lot of people didn't know about that one over the creek. The creek was probably about that deep, but it was a wide open area of limestone and land. So they had an old trestle type bridge that went across this for the train that used to run down there. So once I began to drive and not as dependent on my parents, and once you had permission to use the car, Frisch's was a big Friday night gathering spot up on Far Hills, almost to Whip on that side of the road. Centerville Lanes, the bowling alley, which was just south of Spring Valley on 48 there. There was a Roy Rogers hamburger restaurant that I remember that sat out just on the hill before you start down 48 up to the Concept Plat in that area. And then, obviously, we didn't have Kroger's. That wasn't the big store back then. What Centerville and Washington had was an Imperial Food Town, in fact, 2 or 3 of them, and an IGA. Okay. And the Imperial Food Town was built just off of Sheehan Road, right down there off of 48. So it was the closest grocery store to us, being so far south. And one of the firehouses were built, one of the major reasons it was built on State Route 48 in 1966, Station 3, was because Elder Beerman's came in. Elder Beerman's was like the big box store in Centerville-Washington Township back then. And they came in right there in the south end. So the closest fire station at the time was either Town Hall or Whip Road, and that were the only 2 fire stations. south of town. The township was so much bigger than the city acre-wise and had a population, but it was scattered through such a large area, whereas the city had a smaller population, but it was the density and was higher because it was more condensed. It was right along that corridor from to Spring Valley, probably from Normandy Lane out to Clow Road. And that was where a lot of the population resided in Centerville. So obviously the firehouses are going to be up north and center of town.
Yeah, you mentioned a lot of interesting places, like the bowling alley. I was heartbroken when that went away. I love that. And also Elder Bierman, which is now where the big Kroger is in the Centerville area. Let's move on to what motivated you to become a firefighter.
Well, I'd have to say that my brother and my uncle.
Were they both firefighters?
Yeah, my brother joined the volunteer fire department before I did. We lived, I would say a stone's throw, but Social Road to where old Station 3 was located, which was south of Nut Road on 48 there. And so my brother joined as a firefighter a few years before I did. Really, I wasn't sure I had an interest, but back then we lived in the rural end of town. In fact, it was rural. There was not a stoplight in the 60s, 70s, early 70s from State Route 73 to Spring Valley. So that whole was open concept. So it was two-way stops all along the way. So every intersection you came to, we lived right, you could hear the car crashes where we lived at Social Row and 48. And they were always such devastating crashes because they were high speed. Typically on one side of the triangle, it was a high speed. So my brother, we'd be at home, we'd hear the smash, he'd go, let's go where? Get in a car, we're going to go down here, there's a car accident. So I did that. I jumped in the car one time with him. I went down. He didn't go to the station. He went right down to the intersection. And there was debris everywhere. There was cars in the ditches. There were people laying in the ditches. And I stood back and just watched him go from car to car, person to person, long before anyone else was on the scene, and administer care. And I thought, I want to do this. He's helping people. He's making a difference. I really do want to do this. And then I stood back at the car and watched the fire trucks pull up with the lights and sirens going, the ambulance pull up, the people going around here, loading people up, working on the patients, putting in the ambulance. Off they went, the firefighters securing the scene and things like that. And it was like, wow, there's a lot going on here. I'm interested in that. So I applied to become a volunteer firefighter, but I lived in the center of town. So my brother was at the South Station, and when I did get on in 1979 or was hired as a volunteer, I was on station, which was now Station 1, which was on Maple Avenue. Back to my uncle. My uncle was a fire chief up in rural Ohio in Quaker country, where the center of town had the population, which might have been 40 people, and the rest was all farms in every direction. They had one fire truck. It was all volunteer, including the fire chief. But he led training. He gave direction. He did everything. He wrote for funding. He just tried to improve it. So we would get up there and we would sit and talk, and he'd take us down to the firehouse. And this is when I was younger, even before my brother got on the fire department. And that might be where he got his interest, I can't say. But it was just intriguing to every little kid, at least every little boy, I think, grows up looking at the
Like
fire
the heroes.
trucks, and the people, and you always look up to that. You always appreciate that, and you always have a big smile on your face for those guys and that apparatus, because it's just so much bigger than you are, bigger than life.
For sure. Yeah. Wonderful. I appreciate all your stories and your reflections about that. So going to the history of Washington Township Fire Department, how has the department changed in the 40 years that you were a part of it?
Wow.
I don't know if you can condense that, but...
I'll try.
Okay.
I'd say the biggest change that you can point to, that you can readily see, or that I can readily see, would be the staffing. Back in the early days, they rang a church bell, and when there was a fire, and the citizens of the community knew that, and if they could, they'd respond to where the one fire truck sat, or the hose cart, or they grabbed their bucket out of their house and they ran, because back then there weren't fire hydrants. There were streams and ponds and such. So
and are you talking about that's before you got on the force? This is like history.
Before I got on
this
the
is
force.
how fire.
But the staffing, it relates to staffing, to then going into the early 1900s, where it was you applied and you signed up to be a volunteer firefighter. You still had to buy your own bunker gear. You had to buy your coat and your boots and your helmet if you wanted to be a firefighter. And you had some training, and you knew what to listen for if there was an emergency and where to go. And you were familiar with the equipment, the apparatus, to either drive it or where the tools were or whatever the case was on it. And as the community expanded, obviously through the late 50s, 60s, 70s into the 80s, staffing changed, and it became more volunteers as the community grew. And then it was, well, everybody has a daytime job. They can't be around during the day, Monday through Friday. How are we going to fix this? We cannot afford full-time services at this time. So a part-time, in the 1990s, part-time came about, where we would have people part-time in the firehouse. Initially, this was set up from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. And then the volunteers would take over from 6 p.m. back to 6 a.m. the next day. Part-timers typically didn't work on the weekends, just Monday through Friday. And as, again, the expansion occurred, people became busier. Both people in the household had to work, not just one job, but maybe multiple jobs. They weren't around at nights. They weren't around on weekends anymore. There was a family. There were so many other commitments now. So the volunteers were being phased out, not because we wanted to phase them out or the township city wanted to phase them out. It was because of just life and times changing. So as that happened, there had to be a plan B and a plan C. So plan B was start staffing overnight with part-timers, which means you had to now build firehouses or adjust firehouses with bedrooms for sleeping quarters, living quarters for 12 and 24-hour people. And that was something that when the first round of firehouses were built, Station 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, they weren't built with bedrooms. They were basically built on the volunteer concept. You come in, you get a call, you come in, you get your apparatus, you get dressed, you get your apparatus, you get on, and you drive out to the scene. That really required change to happen, to be honest with you, because in the fire service, they began looking at response times. And while if it fits the community in a farming, rural community or whatever, if that's what they can afford, that's what they do. But as time changed, population grew, response times became more important. So if you could put the people at the apparatus site and they leave from there right at the tone, you save anywhere from 4 to 8 minutes in response and dress time, which is a lifetime for someone that's in cardiac arrest, stroke, or even a fire, and how many times it multiplies itself in the course of 4 minutes, 5 minutes, 6 minutes. you have a better chance of extinguishing the fire and saving life. So when I became chief, we were really hard-pressed for now part-timers also, because people were not going into public safety in the numbers they had once gone into it. They had so many other directions to shoot off into. Interests were changing. It wasn't so much about you lived in your community, you wanted to serve your community anymore. It had expanded past that to you no longer lived in the community. You were looking for a job in some cases. As the part-timers were either getting into the part-time service and realizing that's not where they wanted to be for the rest of their lives, they immediately got out of it. So transition was quick. The ones that did want to stay in it then began to look for full-time jobs because that's what they were aspiring for. So they would be hired in Dayton or Columbus or any one of the communities around us that were starting to grow also and needed to replace retiring folks, or they were expanding their full-time ranks. So, I mean, it wasn't just Washington Township Centerville that was going through this. It was across the board. 70% of the country, firefighters back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s were volunteers. 70% of the firefighters in America were volunteers. The metro areas is where you saw the lump total of the full-time fire service folks. Well, as people grew away from metro, sprawl out into the communities, we had to follow. We were just a little bit behind the curve. Like always in the fire service, we've been accused of 200 years of tradition without change, because, you know, we liked to do things the way we knew how to do things. But progressively, you have to change. And that mindset came along as time went by. That was the biggest probably thing I can point to with staffing today. I hired a record number of full-time as we transitioned, so we became more of a full-time, less of a volunteer, part-time department. And today they've transitioned into nearly a full-time department with the support of the community. The levies, the community pass are so important, but they get exactly what is told to them, what they pay for: a faster service, a more up-to-date service, a more techie service, and faster service, I guess I would say.
And really that goes back to saving lives. So that's exactly what
making a difference
in people's lives. Could you talk a little bit, because you mentioned Town Hall used to be a fire station, is that right? Okay, so how was that in your tenure, or was that previous?
Previous.
Okay.
As history shows, fire department didn't keep a great history through the years. They did keep history. There are some things written down, but there were gaps. And a lot of the history was filled in by the old-timers, the senior members. And it was something to capture those folks after they left the fire department, before the end of life, because they told us they filled in so many of the blanks for us that we would have never known and carried on. So it's like, I guess, campfire talk. We used to sit around and listen and talk, and we'd learn a lot. So the fire department, as I mentioned earlier, you know, when they rang a church bell, they transitioned forward to buying their first fire truck in 1929 in the community. Well, they had no place to store it. So there was a garage, a mechanic's garage, fuel station, if you will, down on South Main Street there on the east side. And it was run by Byram Himes. And so Byram had an open bay, so he said, let's keep the fire truck here. So they kept the fire truck there. And there were maybe a few volunteers back then, but it was, again, community. If the siren went off, if you're available, run to Byram's garage and get on the fire truck. Or if you happen to be there as a customer that day having your car serviced or fueled, and the siren went off, they'd say, "Get on."
Everyone's on board.
Get on, and off we went. Obviously, those rules and laws have changed tremendously for today, for safety purposes too. Right. But in 1937, the communities of Centerville-Washington Township decided, we need somewhere to put the fire truck. And we need to grow. We're growing. We need another fire truck. So on the backside of Town Hall, they decided in 1937 to expand it to apparatus bays. Initially, they built 3, and then they expanded it a few years later to 4. And there was a cistern built under the bays of that area in the back of Town Hall to refill the water on the fire truck tanks, when they come back from fires, because fire hydrants weren't everywhere back then. In fact, they weren't hardly anywhere back then. So they still had to draft from ponds or streams, or they depended on the water they had on their tank that they would fill from the cistern in the underneath the firehouse from the rain gutters that were on the building at the time. That was interesting because in 1940, the city of Centerville and Washington Township, for whatever reason, there was 2 fire chiefs, both volunteer, assigned. Byram Himes was designated the fire chief for the township, and Louis Campbell, who was a volunteer firefighter back then, was designated the fire chief for the village of Centerville. And so at one time, actually in Centerville-Washington Township, there were 2 fire chiefs. And then in 1946, they decided, hey, when we're organized, when you're moving ahead, we have a second fire engine, we have a hose cart, we're growing again and we're expanding. The elected officials got together and decided we need to organize this a little bit better. We need one full-time fire chief to run this organization with however many volunteers underneath them. So in 1946, in February of 1946, the trustees, and I have not seen the city records, but in the township minutes, trustee minutes, it goes back and they voted to hire Louis Campbell as the first full-time fire chief in the city of Centerville, Washington Township. With that came, in that same minutes, in that same meeting, and before I forget, for an annual salary of just under $4,500 a year, I believe it was. With that came, they needed a caretaker for the town hall, a maintenance person. So they offered a job to Louis Campbell. They offered him the second floor, 3 rooms on the second floor for him and his wife to live out of. They would charge him $20 a month to live there. They would pay for the trustees would pay for the gas. Louis would pick up all the other utilities for his living space. And he was paid $500 a year to be the maintenance man for the township building. So it kind of fit in the box because Louis was fire chief. The fire station's connected to the back of town hall, so he could do the janitorial work. And most of the janitorial work was from meetings that was held by both the village and the township, and also from the auditorium for where the stage was for the weekend plays or the weekend meetings or whatever you want to say. So Louis was our first fire chief, and there's a lot of great stories about Louis that I could tell, and that would take way too long that I won't tell.
So we'll have to record those the podcast version 2 with those stories. But you mentioned to me previously about how dispatch has changed. I know that's not one of the questions that I said I would ask, but you mentioned that at some time there was dispatch run out of town hall in the upstairs.
Yeah, that was part of, as I understand it, talking to of the old timers, because if you try to read up on history and you read this, you really can't find it in any of the written chapters.
So this is oral history, which is important as well.
Well, it's oral history, but it comes from a number of sources that both were connected to the firehouse and are longtime residents from the 20s, beginning in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, through the 60s in Centerville, in downtown Centerville there. Well, I learned a lot of stories from them. Town Hall was where Louis now occupied. So there had to be a central answering point for an emergency. Well, there weren't very many emergencies back then, like EMS for sure, or fires. It was still mostly a rural community. There weren't a lot of automobiles. There weren't a lot of intersections that needed stoplights in them. So there was Louis and Fran in 1955. The Washington Township Firefighters Association had an ice cream social, and the proceeds that year went to buying a communications setup. So they bought a base station, and they bought 2 mobile radios and two portable radios and 2 mobile radios, which means there were probably about 60 volunteers then, so 2 people had radios. They had a dispatch center with a console, and then you had 2 monitors that 2 other people could listen at home, which meant, so still the most responsible way to call people and to notify people was with the siren that was on the north side of the building at Town Hall. Well, the phone was answered by either Louis or Franny, his wife, in the town hall for an emergency. What does that mean? Someone had to be in the building, all the time. So they'd receive the call, take the information, and then there were 2 buttons on the north wall inside, one to set the siren off and one to turn the siren off. And they did weekly tests on the siren to make sure it worked. It wasn't just like push the button and hope it goes off. There was 1 fire station. They hadn't built a second firehouse yet, so everybody that was a volunteer was within hearing decibel distance of this siren. And they would hear that siren go off in the middle of the day, in the middle of the night. If they were at work, they'd leave their jobs. It was known. If it was the middle of the night, they'd get up, get dressed, go to the firehouse, which was Town Hall, get on the apparatus, get the note that said it's on Clow Road and there's a tractor fire or whatever the case was. So that system, as time went by, the Firefighters Association in 57, they bought a number of other portable radios. So as time went by, expansion grew. The Fire Association was buying a lot of the communications equipment until it got to the point it was so expensive and we needed to expand so quickly that it was back on the township. So in 1969, they decided to build, well, in 58, they built Station 2, which was up on Whip Road. In 69, they decided to move everything out of Town Hall over to Station 41, the chief's offices, just as they were growing all the offices. Is that
the one on Maple?
That's on Maple Avenue. They also put the communications center there, and now they hired 4 full-time dispatchers. But the full-time dispatchers only worked 8 to 4, Monday through Friday initially. So at night, at 4 o'clock, they would flip a switch in dispatch on Maple Avenue that would switch it back over to Louis and his wife to dispatch, answer the, it wasn't 911 then, answer the emergency phone from 4 in the evening till 8 in the morning. And on weekends, they had the whole...
And they had to be there.
They had to be there.
Wow.
And part of Louis' contract that I didn't mention, it's hanging outside what was my office at the Station 45 headquarters down on McEwen Road. Mm-hmm. The original contract, faded, yellowed, invisible ink sort of kind of going away. What it did say was part of Louis' task were to check every fire hydrant every month and flow it, to keep the equipment updated and in service and cleaned, to maintain the town hall. And it set forth everything that
For
he
$500
needed to
a
do.
year.
Well, and then $133 a month on top of that, which was split by the township and the city.
Okay.
They both each paid half of that wage as fire chief. But he paid back $20 a month
For living there.
for living there, yeah, and utilities.
Right.
But it's really a cool piece of history, his contract, and signed by some of those trustees back then and by Campbell.
And what a service he did for the community. I mean, that you think about people, and thanks for remembering his name and passing that along and sharing that history of what one person did to provide a safe environment for the
He
area.
served from 40. He served as fire chief beginning in 44. I'm not sure exactly what year. He became a volunteer before that, but he served until when he retired as fire chief in 1962. He became the dispatcher, he and his wife, from 62 to 69, and then from 69 to 74, when he officially retired from dispatch, he and his wife did that evening and weekend dispatch. So he stayed involved right up until, I said 74. I'm sorry, I meant 1970. He stayed involved right up until 1970. 74 was the year that Louis Campbell passed.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that story. Appreciate it. I feel like we've learned so much, and you already answered some of these questions. The one I want to get to was, because I think leadership is so important to you, is what does it mean to you to be a leader? Being fire chief for 12 years, you had a lot of leadership opportunities.
Keep your eyes open, situational awareness. But I think it begins with being a good listener. I was always a good listener, although my officers through the years will tell you that I was probably the biggest pain in the butt, because after I would listen, I would take things in and I would digest them, and before the end of class, the end of session, the end of training, I would have my hand up in the air asking a question on something. And they always knew that was coming, and it was like, okay, Gaul, what? What now? What next? But I also had the impression that there was a bunch of other guys here that had the same question, but they wouldn't put their hand up and ask. And I needed an answer because it didn't complete that circle for me. If I only had part of the information and walked away, I didn't feel I was in touch enough. So being a good listener, and that goes back to when I was young in Marlboro, I used to go down to it was about a mile walk, but I used to go down to what today is a big deal, but it was a roundabout in the center of town. And this was back in the 60s, the mid-60s. And there was a park bench, a Civil War cannon, an American flagpole with American flag on it, and about 4 park benches. And these park benches every day were occupied early in the morning until, I really couldn't tell you what time in the day, by senior citizens, male senior citizens. And I would go down, and I would either sit at the base of the flag, or I'd sit on one of the benches if it was open, and I'd listen to these guys talk, and they were veterans. And I just listened. I never said anything. I just listened. And I learned so much about history, not only of politics, or their politics, or the war, or America. I don't believe they ever even saw me sitting there until one day. One of the guys looked over at me and looked back at his buddies and said, "Whose kid is that?" And that kind of shied me away.
You're like, uh-oh, I've been caught.
Yeah, I got to get out of here. But I just, at an early age, I wanted to take so much in. So, and there's so many articles written today about leadership and whether it's you're born with it or you develop it. In fact, I did my college final research project paper on just that subject. And back when I did that, the empirical data wasn't like it is today. Obviously, you didn't have access to all of the things that you have, studies, data points that people have today, to be quite honest with you. So it was kind of a toss-up. Yeah, they can see where in the old ages, in the earlier days, basically if you were in the fire service, you developed yourself up the chain of command, and you might have just came in with no knowledge at all. And as you gained knowledge, you raised your level of experience, you were promoted up until now you were sitting in the seat. And then on the other side, it said, no, you have to have education. You have to have critical thinking. You have to have a worldly view, an open mind to deal with all these different things that might be thrown at you rather than just that closed atmosphere that you might have lived in your community where you worked. I am to the mindset that today I believe you are born with certain traits. You are born with certain genes that come from your ancestors that drive you to do certain things, because you can see a pattern if you look back into your family origin history. But I also will say that being a leader, you develop as you grow, because you're not going to learn everything. One of the biggest things about being a leader is you're always learning. Keep an open mind. But remember to be compassionate. That is so important. To say thank you for the smallest things that happen. Even though it's your job, it's their job, it was my job at one time. To hear the chief come out and say, good job, guys, or bad job, guys, or whatever he said, he at least talked to us. And he communicated that we needed to do something different, or he patted us on the back. And who isn't always up for a pat on the back to say, good job, even though you were just doing your job and you had, the self-awareness that this went well. It worked. Everything happened like it was supposed to. Because in the fire service, quite frankly, it's an utter state of confusion when the alarm sounds. Not on our part because we're trained for that, but it's everything that goes on around you, from responding to the scene and dodging traffic and making your way safely to that area, to dealing with the incident when you get there, whether it was a family member, a community member, it's a hazardous scene. It is just, you have to get a hold of this thing, identify it right away, and then you go from there. So I think you have to be a good listener as you go along. I've had some good leaders that I've worked under as I've gone, and I've tried to pick up the high points. And it was always know when it's time to talk and know when it's time to step back, and work your way up through the system, because it would be awful odd. And that's why as I became chief, for the 12 years I was chief, it was not required that I maintain my paramedic certification. But as fire chief, there was going to be a rare opportunity for me to ride the ambulance again, to use my paramedic certifications. But I also knew that every year I needed to go through protocol testing to know exactly where the frontline folks were and what they were dealing with, to help me understand better where they were coming from and where they needed to be, so that when they walked in, I wasn't totally oblivious. What are you asking for that for? What are you talking about? No, we can't do that. It was more of being in touch and in tune. One thing I wish I could have gone back and done was spend more time in the firehouses. I've discussed this with a number of fire chiefs as I was coming up, before I became fire chief, when I became fire chief, and in my early years as fire chief, and they all said, you got to get out and talk to the people. You got to get out and talk to the guys and girls in the firehouses. Even if it's just for a cup of coffee in the morning, you have to talk to them. And if there's one regret I have, is I didn't do that more. I wish I could have done that more.
Because that's when you learn what's going on, what are the good and the bad.
Well, they get to know
issues.
you because, quite frankly, you don't want to be the light on the hill. You don't want to be the one shiny little thing over there that they don't know. I made it a point in my life that if I was in town, I was available, I responded to every structure fire that we had, not to run the incident, but to make sure that everything was in place to run the incident correctly. And if it was, to step back and say, where do you need me? Mm-hmm. Where do you need me to
Support.
go? What do you need me to do? Mm-hmm. And I mean, that goes miles when you're out there rolling hose or doing a walk around, doing a safety check, doing whatever it is for your troops out there. Because when they see you doing that, you're part of the team. You're not just giving orders from some faraway place. You're actually there. So I made it a point that I couldn't be on every medic call. There is no way. 70% of what we do is EMS, but the fire calls were really where it could go haywire rapidly because of so many moving parts. And safety was a big issue all the time. And it didn't really allow me to sleep. As I progressed up through the ranks in my years, through firefighter, lieutenant, when I was a firefighter, it was me and my team. That's who I worried about. As a lieutenant, my circle grew on who I cared about and who I worried about. But still, I worried about them at work, not so much off work. As I became a captain and deputy chief and then on up to chief, I realized that my sleep wasn't as well at night because...
You're always worrying.
Well, you have this many people on duty. They're doing a job that is not a safe job to be in, to be quite honest with you. There is a lot of risk. You hope you've trained it up right. You've provided them with the best equipment, the best gear. And what's the old saying? Nothing good ever happens after midnight. And there was no phone call that I ever wanted to receive after midnight, because it probably wasn't going to be good.
Yeah. I would love to go to education. How has education helped your career?
Well, I was an odd bird. I was in the generation or decades coming through the fire service where it was still the cousin, the brother, the uncle was promoted through the ranks, and almost everybody had a high school degree. And I don't mean this despairingly, it was just the times. Mm-hmm. Most fire chiefs had high school degrees, and not too much further than that. And that is where circles were run around us by the police service. And I noticed this as I progressed up through the ranks and as I became chief. It's like, why do why does the elected officials, the fire chief who goes in there with his needs and wants and his list for budget time, and the police chief goes in there with his need. Now, you got to remember, police chief's minimum requirement was at least a bachelor's degree, even back in the 50s and 60s. Fire chief, most of the time, was a high school degree, or if they took some classes, maybe a little better. So my analogy of the way it worked was when you go in, or they went in back in the day, and I served under some very smart fire chiefs who had high school degrees. So I don't mean anything bad by that, but they go in, and their presentation for the budget would be, well, we need to put new tires on the fire trucks, and we need to get a new bumper for the engine. And the police chief would go in with this big statistical data report and his criticism of what would happen if they didn't do it and how bad it would go, and just all the storytelling that went with that, drawn off of the educational experiences that he has had, or education, that 9 times out of 10, the money was going to the police department, not the fire department. So we used to
Better presentation, I guess.
So we used to joke in the fire service that, man, the cops get all the nifty tools and all the new devices. How do they do that? Why are we still working with, we have to pull the hose up into the hose tower to let it dry. We have cloth hose. We're still sitting on fire trucks in open cabs, not in closed cabs. Back in the day when I got on, there was no air conditioning. I was of the last generation that rode the tailboard. I got to ride the tailboard of a fire engine during my career, which means you geared up, you climbed on the back, you hooked into the back bar, two guys up front, they drove to the fire, and you're just holding on the back, out with a hose, bouncing up and down on the back of the fire truck. How much fun was that? It was, but it was also so dangerous. I mean, it was not safety. Mm-hmm. But back to education. So as time went by, there were studies done in the fire services. Why are we being left behind internationally and nationally? Why were we being left behind? And there was a project they did of white papers. I forget the project's name in the 1980s. I think it was I don't recall what report it was. They came out with a report that said, we need more education. We need more education past the high school level in our fire service as you progress up in the ranks to really catch on to this bigger picture view that's out there, because we're becoming more diversified. We're growing. We're not just the plumber or the electrician. We're everything now. We're doing hazmat, which was an unknown word back in the early days when I got on, but became terrorist, was never thought of. Those things were starting to appear on our horizons. So we needed people in higher positions to be able to sit in meetings, develop plans that adjusted accordingly in a service that was, quite frankly, lagging behind, in my opinion, a little bit. So it was catch up. So when I graduated from high school, I went to college. I went to Western Kentucky University. I went to Sinclair. I had a 2-year degree. And then I was hired in the full-time fire service, and there were so many certifications and so many classes that really steered me in a different direction than taking some of these college subjects that I thought weren't going to benefit me. As we progressed, and as the fire chief before Ken Parks had said, he said, you need to finish your education. That is becoming a big thing. As trustees became younger, as supervisors, as administrators became younger, they were all educated up to a much higher level, and they appreciated what that would do for the community. And so they wanted to start that chain down through the ranks, and it was important. So when I initially became fire chief in 2007, I had to sign that I would promise to finish my 4-year degree within a period of time. And I did that. But wow, what a difference in 20 years of college in the 70s and college in 2008 and 9. It was totally different. My grades also adjusted too, where I was probably a middle B student in the 70s. I gained all A's in 2000 because I was older, I had the mindset, and this was, my job depended on this. This was important. So I wasn't like this young kid that was trying to figure out where I was going to go. I knew where I was going, and I knew the direction I needed to be, and I wanted to be there. So I finished that degree, and I looked at moving on to a master's, but I made the fatal mistake of letting time 6 months pass and not jumping right back into it. And it's almost like a lifetime when you're in an education at that level, because a lot of it is science, is data, is research, is writing. But the one thing that I will say that I learned a lot in college, and I learned a lot of the things that I talked about, that really helped me. And I learned to be a better supervisor, a better leader, a better person. And it opened up a lot of the areas that I might have been cloudy on before or not as clear on before, but yet I had nobody right in front of me to put my hand up and say, what about that? I don't understand that. What about that? You had to go out and search for it. But critical thinking was one class that I took that I say was probably the most advantageous class that I ever was a part of in school anywhere. I had a Baptist preacher who was my instructor, and it was hell and damnation. I mean, that was the class. It totally was. It was either you're for it or you're against it. There is no in between here. There's for and against. And it was like, my first day I sat down, I went, this is, I mean, I'm more of a listener and take in rather than let's jump into this, and I'm taking sides. So as we worked through the class, we did a lot of study on a lot of areas, but the one thing he really emphasized was always, you're going to have an opinion. You're going to have knowledge. You're going to have to make that decision someday. Yes, no, good, bad, right, wrong. Whatever the decision comes down to, you're all, in your lifetimes, in your jobs, you're going to have to make a decision. So what you need to do is you need to take the other side of that argument, that opinion, that decision that you will have to make and try to justify it in your mind. And I thought, wow, no, I know I'm not so opinionated I can't listen and hear people and change and admit mistakes. I'm not that far. I'm not bad. I don't have that problem, but I'm thinking, so we go around the room, and I got assigned in a group of 3 people to the death penalty. The federal law, should there be a death penalty or should there not be a death penalty? And back then my thinking was, for whatever reason, yeah, it's in place. For horrendous, heinous crimes, you should pay. You should pay. And that, whether that was driven to me or that was the news I read at the time or whatever, but that was what I thought. So he said, what's your opinion? And I said, well, yeah, I'd be for. He goes, then you have to fight for the side of being against. And it was like, oh my God, I've never thought of this. So by that time, we all had to do a presentation, but by the time I was done, or we were making our presentation, oh my God, this teacher grilled me when I was up in front, and he was trying to sway me because he knew that my initial opinion was for, and here I had made the argument against bringing in religion, bringing in federal law, bringing in prisons being over, bringing in all these things I could find statistical data on. He grilled me on it, trying to get me to cave and sway, and I wouldn't. I said no, because the research I had done, quite frankly, showed me that maybe I should be looking at this from a different angle. Maybe there is another side. So when all was said and done, I thought maybe because it was wrong, and I could prove it through the data, 70, 80% of the time, innocent people were being killed, among other reasons. I kind of changed my opinion. And he came up to me at the end of the semester, and he said, congratulations for hanging in there. I said, what do you mean? And I said, your class? He goes, no. He said that day that we did the presentations, he goes, I did everything I could think of to try to get you to cave, and you wouldn't cave. And I said, no, because you opened the door for me. You showed me that I need to look at the other side and make sure that I include that in decision making, because it's not always black and white. Very seldom is it black and white in the fire service. There's rules, but a lot of things happen outside that you have to have the mindset, you have to have the education, you have to have the experience, you have to have the knowledge to base your decision on. And if you've never come across that before, go with your gut, because either you were raised right or you weren't raised right, and more than likely your gut will tell you that, but don't let it end there. Go back and research it and look at it again under a microscope and come back and say, you know what, I made a mistake, I was wrong. And don't be afraid to do that. I never was afraid to say, I know some people don't have "I'm sorry" in their vocabulary, but it's not a bad thing because you learn from that. You're not showing weakness. You're showing, quite frankly, in my mind, that you can be compassionate, you can be focused, and you can be open-minded.
It's a great sermon for today, I think, because it's
Sorry.
I know it doesn't have to be religious to learn that critical thinking skills are important, and that is something that's missing that we need to promote in our society. That discovering and learning and apologizing when maybe you discover that you're wrong. I think that's a valid thing for us to still be discussing in our communities.
As a chief of the department, you also have to realize that you now have a large group of people that sometimes things don't always go right, and you're going to have to stand in front of a council or a board of trustees or citizens and say, "I'm sorry, it didn't go right, and this is the reasons why we feel it didn't go right." But don't start pointing fingers. You take that responsibility because you've taken on that responsibility. You accept it. You say, "We'll do better." I assure you, we'll do better. And here's the timeline on what I'm proposing to do to show that we're doing better. And then go back and maybe have a closed office conversation with some folks. Say, what the heck happened here? Where are we lacking at?
And how can we fix it?
And what are we going to do to fix it? Because either I got to fix you or I got to fix me. Because something
didn't work.
The message didn't get delivered.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, there's still so many things I want to ask you. I think one that's interesting to a lot of people is the Rod and Reel Club, which you promised me you'd share just a little bit about the history of that. And people are always curious about what it looks like. And I remember you sharing how it was a peaceful place that you went to after work.
I had some friends that were members of the Rod and Reel Club, and once or twice they'd take me back in there, and I'm telling you, it is, at one time, and it might still be that way, but being a member so long now that I take it for granted, I guess, but it's one of the best kept secrets in Centerville-Washington Township. I mean, I worked the majority of my career out of Station 1 on Maple Avenue, and I could see, looking out the front bay doors, you look across and you see Tower Heights and you see the water towers to the east. And just on the other side of the water towers is this 75-acre piece of land that is kind of etched down in there that has become a fishing club over time. Was a limestone quarry back in the day. And I would be at work. I'd leave work back when I was on the shift of 8 to 4:30. And within 5 minutes, I would be going in the gates of the Rod and Reel Club. I'd park my car. I'd go to my locker, get my fishing stuff out of my locker, get in one of the boats, all battery powered, and be out on the lake. So within 15 or 20 minutes. And the thing about it was, you were below grade because the rock quarry was etched down, and you're looking up just about, well, everything on the west side you're looking up. On the north side and on the south side, the west side is sort of level. You wouldn't hear noise. The traffic.
In the middle of the city, and you don't hear anything.
Right smack in the middle of the city, and you don't hear anything. And yeah, it's relaxing. It was relaxing. At one time, there was limestone quarried out of that. The records get a little fuzzy when you get back before 1900 in the late, but in the 1800s, they quarried limestone out of there because the foundations of some of our buildings, especially in that downtown corridor right there, were built from the limestone and chiseled from the limestone of that quarry. But there were 6 other quarries, smaller, in the area. But that was also Centerville's main water supply. I believe in 1947, the quarry flooded. They abandoned quarry operations. They struck an underground stream. The quarry filled up. And then the underground stream, to this day, I believe, has gone dry. So it's pretty much runoff water now. But Centerville had a large water source, center of town, where the densest population was located. So they developed a filtration system, and I can go down into the basement. In fact, my friend, who was caretaker at one time, took me down there, and he goes, look at this wall. And looking on the west wall in the limestone foundation down below, there are 2 pipes that have been cut off that go out towards the lake. And he said that was where the water came in from the lake, and it was filtrated here and then pumped out right up to, I believe it was 85 residents here in the center of town area. Mm-hmm. So it was their water supply. But that was abandoned. That was around 1950. It was abandoned as a water supply in 56, and the city moved more towards Montgomery County water. And so in 1960, when they became a city from a village, in 1960, they didn't become a city until 68. In 60, they for sure had everything swapped over, and I believe the township did also, to the Montgomery County water system. If you look really hard today, and you know where to look, you can still find the rails, the railroad car rails, sticking out of the embankment in the limestone above the water on some corners in certain areas of that lake. And if you go around and do some scouting in the woods and the property on the lake, you can find the old junk piles that these guys that work the quarry would leave. They always apparently put their trash in the same area in 2 or 3 spots. There's old pharmacy bottles, old milk bottles from Normandy Farms. They're broken, unfortunately, now, right. But a lot of bottles are still intact. So it is a really nice setting, a really nice, relaxing, comforting place in the center of town. 1960 is when a group of doctors and lawyers purchased that to turn it or make it into a fishing club.
And it's private, so it's not open to the public.
Yeah, thank you.
We just don't want people to. It's meant to be just for members.
If you know someone that's a member, ask them to take you in and see it. Mm-hmm. If you don't know anyone that's a member, get a hold of me.
Well, I would love to go.
I will set up a time.
We'll have to have a Centerville-Washington History visit.
I'll take you in and I'll show you around everything I know. I joined in 1999 and became a member. It was after I was on the waiting list for 3 years. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't until 99 that I got into the club. And then I believe it was 2005, 6. Before that I was on the board, but then I became president. So I was president of the club for 2 years. And I'm still a member today. So I've been in the club quite a while. With all the grandchildren I mentioned in the beginning, I don't have the opportunity as I did back in the day to
take advantage of it as much.
To spend, just drop everything and go out on a weekend or after work, go out and fish and enjoy it over there. But there were a lot of, at the time, my seniors in the club that told me stories of the club, that told me stories of the community. Not just Centerville-Washington, Beaver Creek, Dayton, Oakwood, Kettering, just stories that I'm sure must be written out there somewhere on the history, but I had never heard them before.
Well, you're recording them here today, and I appreciate that. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with us that we didn't get to that would be important to share in a podcast?
Just to take a moment, a good leader is only as good as the people that are around them. So it's important to pick good people that have the drive that you recognize as having the drive and desire, or that someone that you can work with or that will find that desire and drive and passion for the job that you do. Because quite frankly, when I interviewed, and I used to tell them, the guys this, when I interviewed him in the final interview, or when I was a deputy chief or captain and I interviewed for firefighters or volunteer, whatever the case was, you know, is I was going up through the ranks, I'd say, you know, right now I'm interviewing my replacement. I want the person, and in my opinion, I bleed, live, and die Washington Township, Centerville Fire. You know, I did. And I want the person that replaces me to do the same. So I'm not just hiring a firefighter. I'm not just hiring a captain. I'm hiring somebody that I'm looking that someday is going to replace my position. It won't be me, but it'll be my position in the future and bring all the attributes to the table. So it's the people. I always was the one that accepted the awards, that accepted the recognition from the community, from the area, for the fire department. But it was never I, it was us. It's a group of people that can make you look really good or make you look really bad. And I was really proud of every single one of them because I saw the desire, the compassion for the community that I think you need to have. And one of them once asked me, well, what's your two most important things that drive you? You know, this is coming from a firefighter. I'd say to them, well, it's making sure we provide the best care for the community. And that opens up a whole lot of doors because that you get the training you need, that you have the gear, that you have the apparatus, that you have the technology with the dollars that are allotted to us through the community. Okay, that is my number one job. But my number 1.1 job, my number 1A job, my number 2 job, whatever you want to call it, is to make sure you're safe and you go home every day. To make sure when you come to work, you go home from work. Those are the two things that are the most important things on my plate. And every day I come to work, those are the two most important things on my plate. Sure, there's something that pops up at 8:01 a.m. or 7:01 a.m. that we're having a problem. This is going, we got it. Slow down. Let's look at this. Let's think this through. Leaders learn from strong leaders, and you have to have a great support group behind you. So my administrator, my bosses, my trustees were always so supportive of me in the good times and the bad times and the hard times and the easy times. It's really easy to be a leader in good times and easy times. Where it really makes its mark, there's a distinction, is when things aren't going so good. When it's the bad times, that's when you have to pull your bootstraps up and make some of the hard decisions that you're not everybody's best friend, or we got to get through this, and this is the avenue we have to take. Stay focused, stay on course, and stay confident and get it done. But even as a leader, you have to have that support from somebody to keep going. Because if you're fighting folks on this side and you're fighting somebody on this side, you're stuck on an island, and it's just so much harder to accomplish. So I give kudos to all the people that have supported me, that were my bosses, because without that support, I could have never accomplished the levels that I had accomplished. I didn't get into the fire service to be a fire chief. I got in to serve the community, but each step taught me that I need to be a little bit more of a decision maker, a little higher up, to really make these. I can give you all my ideas, but hardly any of them ever flew or got off the ground. So I thought, okay, how do I change this? I keep coming up with these grandiose ideas, but none of them are moving. What I thought were grandiose ideas. And so, you know how you do this? You become the lieutenant, you become the captain, because now you can adjust a little bit more. You can make a little bit more of a change. And I told all of my firefighters in the end, I don't care what you do. I don't care how you do it. You know what I expect. You know what my goals are. You know what the organization goals are. So at the end of your career, when day whatever comes, when 35 years comes, when 25 years comes, when you retire, I want you to get up the next morning, look in the mirror, and see somebody that made a difference, and not somebody who just did a job and got paid Now I'm going to just relax. Make a difference in people's lives. Everything you do, make a difference. It's all about how you communicate, how you operate, make a difference. And if you see that person looking back at you, good. I'll be there to pat you on the back some more, or whatever the case is. And the last thing I'd say is, as one more thing, the contract I started to refer earlier to for Louis Campbell, one of the stipulations in his contract back in 1946 was that, and he signed a year-to-year contract, and then one in 47, the only thing that changed was the wage from year to year. All the rest stayed the same until he finally was out of that contract. But in 1946, in that contract, if you read down through it, it did say that you will be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year for the length of this contract, which means you will be fire chief for that January 1st to December 31st, however you want to look at that. You're the fire chief. You're here. You've got to be here. And part of the verbal history that was carried through was Louis Campbell, in his years of service, 16, I believe, as fire chief, one time went out of town. And in the contract, it said, if you do leave town, it's your responsibility to assign a fireman, an officer, or a member of the community to be fire chief for that period of time, and you pay that wage out of your pocket.
Wow.
Louis Campbell was gone. Again, this is verbal history. One time in that time period, he went to Michigan. And why was he going to Michigan? To pick up a fire engine and come back.
Wow.
So he had to assign someone to take his place and then pay them to do that while he was gone.
And it was really a work assignment anyway.
It wasn't like that back then.
No. Oh, my goodness. No, it's just amazing to think about. And I think that's why we talk about history, is because, you think about the people that came before you and the service that they provided. And I really think that you've taken us on a journey and understanding a little bit what it's like previously, and also what it's like as a fire chief and leadership. And so I appreciate the time that you've taken today to spend with us.
But there is also so much more.
There is, absolutely.
I'm sorry. I feel like I have something on my face. And so maybe we can talk some more.
Absolutely.
I've always said that I do need to write, and people I used to work with, when I worked with them, said, you got to write down some of this stuff, because if we don't ask the questions, we don't know. And you're leaving, and you carry at least a history back to 1979. Mm-hmm. And we'd like to learn some of the things that previously happened and it has changed. And I'm the same way. When I came into it, it's like, fill me with information.
Right.
I didn't realize, though, at that time we wouldn't have it written down. Mm-hmm. A lot of it was not written down. But anyway, that's.
And now we have this recorded. This is something, and then hopefully it'll motivate you to write more down and include that in with other people that have come after you. So appreciate your time today, and grateful we had the chance.
I hope it made
a
difference. I really do.
I think it did, and I loved what you said about leadership as well. That's applicable to everybody and not just relating to history. It's today.
Thank you, Susan.
Yeah. So thank you also to Miami Valley Communications Council for helping to produce this podcast, and to my guest, Bill Gaul. If you have an interesting story about Centerville or Washington Township, please contact Centerville-Washington History. Please also come visit our museums in Uptown Centerville Tuesday through Friday, 12 o'clock to 4 p.m. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and visit us at CentervilleWashingtonHistory.org. Thank you and goodbye.